I'm Miwa Messer. I'm the producer and host of Poured Over. And I met Garth Risk Hallberg in 2014, 2015. It was right as City on Fire was coming out. And 900 something pages of City on Fire. And I tore through that book. I read it really, really quickly. And now Garth is finally back almost 10 years later. I am kind of curious where you went, but The Second Coming, which is only 586 pages. And yes, I counted. I checked before we jumped on the call. Dude, it's really good to see you, but where have you been for 9 years?
Where have I been for 9? I've just been in my life, you know? I feel like this thing, interesting and kind of cool thing has happened in the culture where most people's lives, when they're in their lives are also in your life. And I just I never got a smartphone. Like I managed to not join each social network as it rose in popularity and then ignominiously crashed. Like I just kind of never got myself together. And, you know, writing a novel is it's long distance running. So I've just been working on the book and occasionally, you know, busting out a book review if someone asks, but I'm doing my thing. Oh, also I should mention I have 4 children. So that's like.
Yeah, we've doubled the cast since I last saw you.
Yeah, started with 2. It started, you know, what would be and now I have a tetralogy of children. So that's also, you know, when I say in my life, it's what I mean is mainly on a bench at the playground still all these years later.
Okay, but if I remember correctly, City on Fire happened partially because you sat on a bench in Union Square Park and in about 45 seconds realized you had the spine of a book that, granted, you put it in a drawer for a minute because you were like, I'm not ready to write this book. I'm super not ready to write this. But the way we sort of legendarily describe it is in about 45 seconds, you outlined the basic thing, said, I'm not in a place to do this. You put it away, and then 4 years later, you come back and you're like, I think I can write this. And then we get City on Fire. So The Second Coming has a much smaller cast and a much tighter focus. You do bounce a little bit. There's a little bit of the 90s. There's a little bit of 2021. But mostly it's the early aughts in New York. And we're going to stick with 3 characters. We're going to stick with Ethan, his ex-wife Sarah, and their daughter Jolie. Because there's a lot that's going to happen. We don't want to spoil any of this. But structurally, 7 sections, smaller cast, not the 1970s. Where did this start for you?
So it's funny hearing you kind of exhume the City on Fire origin story. And I'm also churning through like, man, where have I been? Good question. A weird feature of my writing life is like things like it's like long gestation, or I almost feel like these projects exist, like all the books I might ever write are kind of already there somewhere in here. Like I have a little germ, like a little note written down. And this one, like out of all of them, is the longest gestating. So this idea goes all the way back to the 90s. Hence, we should have some 90s material in the book. And it was just it was about initially a young father who was coming out of just having basically set his life on fire through addiction and various other forms of personal irresponsibility and insanity. And then him becoming convinced that the only thing that can help his daughter survive is him, and that he has to kind of re-enter the life he's burned down and try to save the most important thing, which is her. And I had that idea and it just kind of sat there. I couldn't get it to work. I was too young. I didn't have kids, interestingly. I wrote a whole draft of it in probably 2003, which I've never looked at again, except for one page that I knew was good that I saved. And like, then I came back to, I knew it was going to be the next thing I did after City on Fire. But when I came back to it, weirdly, I had forgotten that the daughter was a daughter. So I started writing and it was a father and a son, and it really wasn't happening.
Yeah.
And I was like, the ghost of the previous draft was like kind of too much there. And then there was one day in, I want to say it was 2016, and like Jolie just arrived.
Okay.
Oh, she was supposed to be a girl all along.
Yeah.
And in order for the book to work, she has to be 13 and 14. She can't be, 6 or 7 as she was, in the 90s when I imagined this, or 3 or something.
Right. When you don't know anything about kids.
Yeah. No, but except for having been one, of course. And then it just totally like took off with her.
So you pick an adolescent kid, an adolescent girl, as the heart and soul of what's going to turn out to be a very large book, because what you're trying to do and what you do in this book is not simple. I mean, you start with a family, and this is the fun because everyone's family is more interesting than your own. But does Ethan show up next? Or are you looking at Ethan and Sarah as a unit and then you sort of scroll backwards from it? Because this book doesn't exist without Jolie as she is. It just doesn't.
Right. It's all her. It's just like the driving force of the book. And I remember kind of like, in Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, where like the Fontumnus or whatever his name is appears by the lamppost, and like I don't think one of the kids actually like grabs hold of his scarf and gets dragged, but it's kind of like that. I just grabbed onto her like violin case and got dragged after her into her life. But I already had Ethan as a character. I mean, that was, I had that from, the 90s, but I just could never find my way deep enough inside.
Okay.
I think because there's too much of me in him. And so having Jolie, like, all of a sudden took that pressure off, and I could just kind of, slowly get him to trust me and let me in.
But even in this iteration, you feel like Ethan has a lot of you?
Oh, yeah. I mean, they're both, it's funny. It's like, and it's also a commonplace, I guess, of writing fiction, but like, they're both like very much me, different parts of my life and just the way I experience the world. And that also gives them this strange feeling because they're at odds. I don't think I'm spoiling anything to say they're at odds through much of the book.
Yeah.
But like, there's this strange way in which they're connected in a way that no other pair in the book is.
I mean, Ethan comes out of a complicated story. He's a little stunted. I said that with love, not judging Ethan, but he's immature. He never
I'm
quite.
shocked to use the modifier a little.
Okay, well, I'm trying to be generous because, no, Ethan's kind of a hot mess. He's a hot mess, but he's fun to read.
Yes.
He's really, really fun to read, but he's a hot mess.
Yeah. And that's I too am periodically a hot mess. So that was it was nice to have a place to put that.
Right.
But I was also interested in it's not like a question of likability exactly. How complicatedly messed up can you let a character be? And with a particular propensity for meaning to do one thing and fully walking into a room believing that that's the thing he's going to do, and then just something takes over and he does the opposite. And
likability is a word that gets tossed around with female characters all the time. Totally. Women and girls get that, you see it in reviews, you hear people talking about it, and they're just, I just don't like them. And I will say there were times that Jolie and Ethan, and to a certain extent Sarah, because sometimes she gets in her own way too, might challenge me on the page, but it was never a matter of do I like these people or not. It was what happens next, because we're all human, we're all messy, we all do our thing, whatever, but the way that they are connected and the way that they genuinely do want to do the right thing and just kind of can't get it together, I never quite knew exactly where you were going.
So that's great, because that was incredibly important to me.
Yeah.
We talk about likability, right? But like, we also, I think, as readers, or if you're anything like me, like you hunger for like redemption, and you hunger for change. Like you want like something at least you want those to be the stakes.
Yeah. So for me, change comes first. I need to see an arc.
Yeah.
But I don't necessarily need redemption because I'm not sure everyone gets that. Like, I just, I totally understand where redemption fits in a narrative. I just need to see some sort of evolution. And it doesn't even have to be like, I'm just going to use a bad example, but like I moved from Connecticut to Texas. Like, that's not the kind of change necessarily I'm talking about, but it's more a matter of, and you put all of your characters into, sort of tepid water, and then you keep turning up the heat and watching them respond when they're all very well intentioned. That's the thing. Like, everyone's very well intentioned, but man, they can't get it together.
Well, so I kind of wanted, that's what I was going to say is like, you may even be like easier. You might be like a cheaper date than I am on the likability front, because I'm like, I see where wanting redemption, like kind of as a knee-jerk thing, can be cheesy, like particularly if you read as many books as you do, but it is somewhere in the mix for me. Like, I really,
okay.
I want to want a character to be better, but that puts all this pressure on likability, because I can't just be like, oh, this person's got a heart of gold. Like, they're fumbling their way through, but I know they'll be okay. Like, I really, in order for the change to mean something, I have to really be in suspense about, is this person going to, like end up, like, could things go so far off the rails that because we can all be very well intentioned and end up hurting people left and right. Like, I know this from my life, right? Like, it's not enough to be like, but we're well intentioned and therefore we're likable. I was interested in getting into that area where, particularly with Ethan, because you're sitting there with Jolie, and it's like this wanting to give up on him repeatedly, and then like just not quite being able to, as a child parent dynamic seemed like that was the space I wanted to take it into. And it's not always a comfortable space.
Right. And frequently we get the narrative where it's the well-intentioned parent dealing with the child who's gone completely off the rails. And, Ethan has his moments of going off the rails, but he is trying. And it's wild to see it flipped in this way. And it's really kind of refreshing to see someone else muddling through, because we put a lot on kids, especially child narrators. We're kind of like, well, you're supposed to be wise, and you're supposed to be this, and you're supposed to be that. And Jolie doesn't really conform to any of it. This kid, I don't think I've ever met a kid like this in a novel like this, a giant family story, right? Where she's kind of like, yeah, no. At one point she shaves her head, which I thought was a really nice touch, but there's other stuff that happens, and she's just really her own person.
That was also really important to me, that she not be a type. And to be honest with you, I'd be curious to hear you on this, but like, I had grown a little bit frustrated with presentations, or frustrated is the wrong way of putting it. I had some questions about the presentation of women protagonists in novels of our age. Girls like who are really on their phone, kind of growing up space, and the presentation of them and whether they have agency or not. And I'd read, like, I'm not going to name names, of a series of, I thought, interesting books, but where I was like, well, this character from start to finish, if I stand back from it, is just kind of like things are happening to her. And that feels like it is probably one experience of young womanhood. But I wanted to get far enough inside this character that I could see the places where she felt that she had room to be her own person and make decisions that changed things.
Right. And the easiest way for me to describe it is, I'm not sad when there isn't a cell phone in a book. We can't really get lost anymore the way we used to be able to get lost. Like, I'm taking you out of the equation for 2 seconds because you don't have a smartphone, but I carry 2 cell phones. So if one of them goes down, and I keep things separate and all of this other stuff, but I am walking around with 2 supercomputers in a pocket, which is wild to me. And it's harder to get lost. It's harder to not have information. It's harder to stumble into something. And in real life, that's one thing. But on the page, it kind of makes for a less interesting
frictionless. I know what
Yeah.
you're talking about. And so what was interesting to me, like sitting slightly outside that experience, and particularly thinking about 2011, which is like the Great Recession, it's like maybe in the first couple of years of Facebook's hegemony. And so these kids are like on it, but much like us, like they don't really totally understand like what it means to be on it or what's going on in the back end or what it looks, and the connections can be like a little janky, and like people are lying about where they are. Things are, that frictionlessness, I think, is actually kind of an illusion. So I was interested as I wrote into the novel to discover like, no, I can have some of this technological experience in here and still have some of the frictional pleasures of the novel, and still frankly have Jolie think of herself in certain moods as a person who's not just a passive, consumer of, endlessly scrolling what's out there, but like kind of a headstrong person with desires and wants and intentions, and she's going to act on them.
In 2011, when I realized where we were for the bulk of the story, to have us in sort of that moment where possibility felt very different. Just everything felt different, right? Like 2011 feels like it was a really long time ago.
Doesn't it?
And like a lifetime ago. And it's wild if you really do the math, right? Like the 70s in some ways feel like they're a total lifetime ago, but the way you're working through the narrative in City on Fire, right? It's a coming of age story. Like anyone can relate to a coming of age story. It doesn't matter. You can come of age when you're 70. It doesn't matter. But this particular book, these people feel very much of their time and of their moment. And it felt to me as a reader that it was a very sort of deliberate choice to pick that moment. And I think it's not just the technology. Can we talk about the setting for a second?
Yeah, totally.
So why? Why 2011? I mean, it gives you just a little bit of distance past the Great Recession, but things are still weird.
Things are still super weird. I mean, I think we look back now and say, oh, you're past the Great Recession. 2011, you're still like, is this thing over yet? Like, yeah. It's been going on for just the vibes were kind of bad, but the vibes were also like, and this, in this way, it's not so different from City on Fire. The vibes were kind of like, well, however we build our way out of this thing, we're certainly not going back to, the way things were in 2006, like pre-recession. And in fact, that's exactly what we did. We sort of we didn't reimagine much of anything. There was that like little beautiful moment of like Occupy Wall Street sort of happening. And then we kind of closed down and we returned to normal. But that opening was there. I mean, I know that. I walked those streets. I was aware of it while it was happening and taking notes. And in some ways, I think it parallels what's going on in Jolie's personal life. Like she's at this moment where some of us have been at that age, 13, 14, and you're like, I don't know what's going to happen, next, but certainly can't continue like this. So that mirroring was interesting. And just there's something I remember about that time of it was the beginning of the moment that we're in now of everybody kind of having their eye on some global picture outside of their personal life, what's going on. So just, I'm spending 3 hours a day consumed by climate anxiety, that sort of thing. And I was interested in the possibilities for the characters around Jolie to be kind of abstracted by macroeconomics and the universe falling apart or whatever, and totally missing what's going on with her personally. That seemed to not be something that I could have pulled off setting this in the 90s.
No, the world would have been totally different. I mean, I'm just sort of running through mental scope of, I think parenting was different. I think just the way we engage with information was different, the kind of information we were looking for. I mean, the world was still...
So the 90s, in my experience, was the kids are in the room They're hot messes. The adults are off who knows where. They're at work and the kids are home alone. The 2011 is like mom's in the room, Jolie's in the room, mom's, on her phone, Jolie's got something else going on. And they're just kind of missing each other in this way while being physically very close.
And Sarah, because again, there's also this gender breakdown that has happened sort of traditionally, even in literature, where you're like, oh, mom's supposed to be the stalwart and the steady one. And, here's Ethan attempting to put himself back into his daughter's life in a way that, dads were not necessarily expected to do. Even now are kind of not expected to do. And I liked that shift as well, because it's kind of like, well, Ethan's just not going to ever be that guy who puts on a tie and works a 9-to-5 life and comes home and, granted that whole necktie thing is fading as well, but he's just never going to be, he's not capable.
It's unclear if he's even ever going to have a job.
Well, there's that.
The necktie is so aspirational for where he's sitting.
Kind of is.
Like, can I, have a job at all? I think for him. But then as a father, he does have this thing that Sarah's like very professionally, on an upward trajectory. She's very committed, at least outwardly, to the work she's doing. She's a professor, very ambitious. And so they're like, foils in a certain way, but he is the one who has this kind of almost maternal, in classical terms, like instinct, like something's going on with her and nobody else can see it. And I know it's there and I have to do something about it. So there's this kind of scrambling of the parental schema.
There's a lot of scrambling, though, that happens in The Second Coming. And that's the fun of reading this book. I mean, I don't want to sit down with 500 plus pages and think I know exactly where you're going. But I do want to talk about influences for a second, because if I remember correctly, when you were writing Sitting on Fire, you were thinking about Bleak House, but watching The Wire. Underworld, the Don DeLillo novel, obviously a huge influence on the structure. Also a little bit of Bolaño and Savage Detectives, also in the way you were playing with time. And certainly you've got a much larger cast covering, I don't want to say a larger period of time, but it is the time is compressed, but the cast is, a lot larger than what we have here. So can we talk about the influences you were thinking about when you were doing this? Because I don't feel like we're back in Dickens 2.0. No. I feel like you're doing something different here.
The things I was reading that were meaning a lot to me were things that were unlocking ways of making really complicated characters. We're finding like new kinds of complications in your character. Right. So I would say the two things that had the biggest impact on me as reading experiences. Mm-hmm. I'm like so interested. You're either going to be like, I knew that, or you're going to be like, right. What are you talking about? Are one, the Knausgaard.
Yep.
And number two, the Ferrante. I didn't get anything structural from them. I didn't get anything like technical. I didn't get anything like to do with scenes. It was just like emotion. It was like, I just loved how deep into the emotions that we're not supposed to talk about both of those writers were going in a way that made me really, really confused for years whenever anybody would use the term autofiction, because to me, like a lot of what would go under the kind of marquee of autofiction were things that were like more cerebral experiences. And I experienced the Knausgaard as being like the opposite, just like almost anti-cerebral, just like pure emotion. And I find that in the Ferrante too. Not that the characters aren't thinking, but that you're not sitting there going like, what a stimulating piece of literature, like what a fine insight or a pithy, you're just like, oh my God, is she going to really do that? Is Lanu going to put up with this? Like that emotional volcanic thing. And I think it has to do with these characters who are the sum of like every moment that they've ever lived
Right.
is still alive in them somewhere. And if you push on it, it's going to cause them to act.
Yeah, no, both of those make perfect sense to me. I'm also just thinking about the fact, too, when you talk about autofiction, there's a presumption with writers of color, right, that something might be autofiction when in fact it is not. And so the idea that, you know, we've got these, and I suppose you could argue that the Ferrante isn't autofiction, but I don't know. I don't buy that. But there are some people who are like, well, we don't even know who Ferrante is. I've read enough. The social novel, right? You write social novels, right? Like you are trying to figure out how we become better people and participate in the world and how we sit in our bodies in the world and like how we're part of this thing. And, you know, people go back and forth, right? Like, do we need social novels? What's the purpose of the novel? Why do we still do this? Like, do we just want to tell stories or is there something more to it? And part of the fun for me reading your stuff is there's always this sort of simmering bit underneath it. So even though you were pulling from, you know, Dickens and Henry James, that was your big Henry James moment. For City on Fire, to have you pulling from Nosgard and Ferrante as inspiration for Second Coming just makes perfect sense. It's the evolution of you. It's the evolution of your voice. It's you getting a little older.
It's me wanting to get closer to the simmer. You know, like the cast was so wide in City on Fire, and I feel very deeply attached to each of those characters.
Yeah, Mercer was my guy. I love that guy.
Even at 900 pages, that you know, in that structure of a novel, there's not room to go all the way down and like sit in the simmer. You know, like you raise the temperature more quickly on the water, you know, boils a little faster. And I just thought, you know, the experiences that are at the center of this book, which are addiction, depression, divorce is in there somewhere. You know, it's like everybody in the family is sort of taking it for granted, but like somewhere in there, there's like real grief about this divorce and death. Like my experiences of those personally have not been, I'm going to take a quick dip down into the quickly warm water, touch a toe, then like get on with things. It has been like, I'm going to have to sit here in water I want to jump out of until I like absorb what it has to tell me. And so there was something about Knausgaard, Ferrante, and their willingness to just kind of, you know, put a hand on the burner and hold it there and feel it a little bit, that I thought I needed in order to like write about these subjects, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it totally does. But did writing this book change you as a person, or did it change you as a writer?
Yes to the first, as a person, and it remains to be seen as a writer. Like I would hope that it did. Like I didn't want to do, you know, City on Fire Part 2, or like even more City on Fire, City Back on Fire. But and so
City over the bridge on fire.
Like I wanted to do something. I think me as a writer is just someone who's going to want to do something different every time. Right. So as a person, there's the material, the underlying material on this book, like the hot material is, it might as well be autofiction, you know, weirdly enough, like it's a very like novel-y novel. You don't feel like you're reading like any kind of coded biography, but that's all like me in there. And so being able to, I've written about addiction before. I've written about divorce before. I've written about death before, but I haven't, like, except for maybe death, like they were never quite like right at the center. And I was like, I need to move to the center and I need to write about them. And that just will change you as a person. Like, you know, talking about stuff that you've basically never talked about.
You know, and also this book is in some ways more claustrophobic, certainly, than City on Fire, but it's also more claustrophobic than some family stories. I mean, and it is because you're sitting with these characters in a way that not every writer will dig in on. And I'm just thinking of a couple, and again, I'm staying away from spoilers, but there are a couple of different points where Ethan makes decisions about his kid that anyone else would be like, I'm sorry, I'm the adult in the room. Like, what are you talking about? Again, very well intentioned, doesn't think he's doing it, but the consequences are not a thing that Ethan ever thinks about. And yet he's like technically an adult man, right? And it's just his brain never quite got there. And like you can see where Sarah managed to work her way through some of it, not all of it, but some of it. And then she's just decided, I'm going to put the rest in a box because I can't. And their kids looking at both of them going, I don't, like, how do you model yourself on that level of dysfunction, right? You can't. You can just make bad decisions.
Well, as you're talking, and I'm also thinking about this, I'm also like still thinking about this like influence question is, I read that Parl's essay on the trauma plot.
Oh, yeah.
Which I thought was like really interesting. And I totally like vibed with it on a certain level. And I think it said what a lot of people are thinking. And at the same time, I walked away from it and I was like, does that mean like we're not supposed to be writing about trauma? Like on some level, that's all there is to write about. So there's some kind, I mean, depending on how you define it, but like there's some kind of way of like, it's not that the subject is trauma. So there's some kind of way of talking about it or packaging it that's gotten very mannered. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I think one of the reasons I think you feel like the Ferrante feels like autofiction,
right,
is that book is like there is a sense of trauma like all over the book, but she's not using the word trauma and she's not even conceptualizing it as trauma. It's just the world that her characters live in. You know, it's just like stuff happens and it changes you as a person. So I think in this, another way of saying what I was saying is like, the book is, takes up several different kinds of trauma. And one of the things that I think is kind of a signature of that I see in the Ferrante is like, people just kind of get stuck at the moment when it happened. If it didn't. And so Ethan, it makes sense to me that Ethan is stuck around 17. He just can't, he's 33 for much of the novel. But like all of his kind of higher order functioning is that of a 17-year-old. And 17-year-olds don't think about consequences at all.
And even when she was 17, Sarah, his ex-wife, was a little further ahead.
Oh, like what? Yeah,
really different kind of 17. I'm curious to see who Jolie will be at 17.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I think she's going to be much like her mom, very advanced. For better or for worse, not thinking about consequences on Ethan's part opens up the path to all kinds of possibly positive consequences as well. It's like, if you can survive this, thing that shouldn't be happening, maybe you will come out of it stronger than you would have been. Maybe this is just the thing that will break you open, Jolie.
Part of your background includes criticism. And at one point you talked about wanting to write an essay saying, why are we even dealing with backstory? And I'm paraphrasing you poorly, but like backstory, right? Like I want to talk about this sort of, not a Venn diagram, but the intersection of backstory and actual history, because the pieces that you pull in from Sarah, that you pull in from Ethan, certainly, I sort of feel like we need their backstory. But I know you're approaching it slightly differently, and I do want to bring it in here because obviously that was a lot of what happened. A lot of the discourse around City on Fire was, wait a minute, why did we just spend X amount of time going down this road? And you're like, well, actually, it all makes sense because when you read it as a whole, you need the backstory. And then here I am reading you say, I really want to write this essay. Yeah, well, I want to write an essay called Against Backstory. That's literally what you said.
That's a good pull. Like, but the thrust of the essay, it's not like the existence of history or memory for people that like bothers me at all. It's more like I feel like the term backstory and the idea of it. And the best example is the TV show Lost.
Okay.
where they would alternate between the character's present and their past. And by the time you got to the end of anyone's past, you'd be like, oh, that explains everything. Like, here we are in the present.
Okay.
And all of their pasts sort of matched. And in fact, this goes to the trauma plot. It was like each character had some equivalent trauma staged exactly the same way. And once you had lived through that in their past, you could understand, it would explain away who they are in the present. I was interested in, and this is in City on Fire too. Like I remain interested in sort of flipping that and being like, actually, like the past is what's alive and changing and mysterious and unfathomable. And the characters have to go there into their, and their own past and figure out what it means in order to like have any kind of story in the present. Like in some ways, so it's not that I want characters who have no past. It's like I wanted the past to have the same tension, the same suspense, and the same complexity and mystery that we look for in the present. So that every time you have to move from the past into the present, you're like, no, wait, I kind of want to stay here and see more. And every time you have to move from the past, from the present to the past, you're like, no, but I'm having so much fun going forward. Like I wanted that.
And part of my approach with that too is you can't have one without the other, right? And I know how simplistic that sounds, but if it's done poorly, right? If you keep getting yanked out of a story because someone's decided I need to know about this 25-minute meet cute on the corner of X and Y in 1985, there needs to be a payoff. And this always goes back to structure for me, right? Like, okay, I can read purely for language. I can absolutely read a novel straight through for language. Just be like, that's the most beautiful thing I've ever read, rock on. Maybe I carry it around with me, maybe I don't. For me, voice is that weird combination of great language and stuff happens because that's how we get change, right? Without change, it's kind of just a very nice reading experience. And oh my God, maybe you get a great line out of it,
What I hear you saying is like the change, like in order to be worth tackling in a novel, like a character's past should be as pregnant with change as their present is.
Yes.
And that's all I meant by being against backstory. Because what I felt the backstory had become is like, yeah, we know all this already. Sort of sense something went awry. We know they didn't get married and it didn't, something went awry at the altar. But now here's the chapter where I show you the thing going awry at the altar. And like, oh, so that's how it happened. Like I made a Seinfeld right there. It's like there's no change there. There's nothing to be unlocked. For these characters, including Jolie, their relationship with what's happened in the past is still dynamic because they haven't really, been willing to look it in the face. Like they're going to have to like sit with it. Ethan's is a little more straightforward because he's got this history of addiction. He's got losses that he went through, coincident with that. But Jolie has lost her father. He has been swept away to rehab and then, essentially being quarantined from her. And, when you pick her up at the start of the novel, she's just like not looking at that at all. She's like, I have no backstory. I'm just here.
Yeah. No, she definitely doesn't think she has backstory, but she's not only lost the physical presence of her father, she's lost the idea of her dad.
Yeah.
And I think, especially as kids, right, we conflate our ideas of our parents with the actual human that stands in front of you. And you're like, you're a person? What? Like, that moment when you're a kid and you discover that your parents actually had lives before you and your siblings existed. And you're like, what? You're a person? No, you're my parent.
Totally.
And watching her sort of unfurl how she feels about the idea of authority and parents and adults and just sort of looking around going, well, I'm being raised by wolves. It's fun watching this kid.
And by the same token, parents, I think, have the same thing with their children.
Right.
That thing where you're like, what? You have a life? Like, you're just my kid, you know? Like, I'm leaving the house. Do I have my keys? Do I have my umbrella? Do I have my kid? You know,
Right, right, right.
like, and it's, as a novelist, I should be like really good at resisting that, I think. And yet I find myself doing it too. And then sometimes I'm like driving the car and I look over and I've got one of my kids in the seat. And I'm like, man, like you're like a whole Mrs. Dalloway is happening inside you right now. And the memory is being made. And like, I had just totally lost sight of that. And so both of these characters, you know, I'm going to stay away from, you know, the redemption word. I don't know how you feel about that.
No alien.
How about journeys? How do you feel about journeys?
Yeah, journeys. Let's use journeys. Journeys we can
journey to a place where they can like encounter each other as, you know, full, complex, you know, rewarding, sometimes messed up, possibly forgivable, possibly unforgivable characters.
But also the novel is the best place to do this, right? Like we get to experience time and interiority in a novel in a way that we don't with other art forms. Like it's just, there's no other way to do what we can do.
Those are my drugs of choice now. You know, at 45, I'm like, time and interiority are my drugs of choice. And so the novel for me is like, is almost a sacred thing. I think that time and interiority are the things that I feel and that Jolie feels are kind of under attack. You know,
without a doubt.
In 2011, sitting in the middle of, you know, in what she doesn't yet know are the latter stages of the Great Recession, like trying to relate to the world through a phone, she feels in some way, you know, time and interiority. Nobody has time for my time, and nobody has interiority for my interiority. She should be reading more novels, obviously.
She'll get there. She strikes me as a kid who's going to be a rather ferocious reader. Now, she may not think of herself as, you know, the foremost American teenage poet, but sorry for that reminder. But I'm sorry, that still makes me laugh that you were just I am a teenage poet. And I'm like, all of the 1 week. Listen, that's longer than some kids get. Now, I think Jolie's going to find her way. I mean, just based on my experience of that kid. And yes, I'm talking about a fictional character, like she's real, but this is the novel. And I think ultimately I have more faith that she's going to be okay rather than the adults.
You grew up in New York, didn't you?
Part-time in New York. Massachusetts and New York. So like I have the permanently raised eyebrow at Adolescent Authority. I just absolutely, it's like, oh, right. Technically you're in charge.
There's a very New York, like there's a side of her, you know, I knew all these, when I was about that age, like I knew kids who were from New York and they had that, like, you know, it was hard to believe that they weren't going to be okay. Like, you run into a burning building, you know, and you'd be like, you'll probably be okay. Like you can navigate the subway at 10, like you're probably, she and Sarah are both New York. And that's part of the way that their time and place like really makes them. And that was fun to write. Yeah,
no, I can see that. Yeah, I really think Jolie's okay. I really just ultimately that character is going to be who she needs to be. But I did appreciate the grandparents. Sarah's parents, they're kind of new. I haven't really seen grandparents like that before, where they're like, they actually still have their relationship and they do love their kid and they do love their grandkid. They're just kind of a little clueless, but they know that they're clueless. And that was really fresh. I mean, there's just a lot where when you read these big multi-generational sagas, you're just kind of like, okay, I get where we're going. And I'm leaving out a bunch of characters. I haven't even mentioned a bunch of people. It feels like as much as you were working with death and depression and addiction and all of the big sort of grief kind of questions, that you were having a little more fun writing this book in a way, not necessarily the entire time, but there is sort of a sense of, I'm also thinking of some stuff that goes down in a hotel room where Jolie makes a questionable decision and we see sort of what happens from there. But of course she's 13. This is exactly, or 14. This is exactly what she's going to do because she's. So it had to be fun. Anything has to be fun for me to write it. Okay.
Like I can't motivate my I mean, I would say even more so, the more kind of trying to go to the hard places and go to the pain points, more of that I'm trying to do, like the more I also need some fun. I'm just not going to want to go to the desk in the morning. The shape of the book really, I know you're big on structure, is like it started, as this very like, I don't want to say austere, but like I was just like I have these two characters, Ethan and Jolie, and like the claustrophobia that you're talking about,
Right, right.
like stripped down because it's stripped down for them. And each of them feels like the world has been somewhat emptied out of people. Like, and that's a depressive experience and that's an addict's experience, like that's a commonality. And I think that that's there for a whole range of difficult experiences that people have. You really feel alone. And I knew weirdly where I wanted to go in the end, which we're not allowed to talk about.
Right. Okay. But I know what the end is, and that makes sense that you knew that that's
right.
I get.
I get.
That's
that I
where
totally we would go, because I knew I had to like meet that kind of spareness at the beginning with its and the inaccessibility of other people with. I had to meet that at the end with whatever is the opposite. We're like turning there. In between was like this big question by design. I was like, I'm going to just find my way. And I'm going to be willing to take left turns and right turns. And like Dorothy lands in Oz, and she's like, I got to get to the Emerald City. There's this yellow brick road, apparently, but like, who knows who I'll meet along the way, And so the middle had that quality, that exploratory quality, and also say yes to things quality. Like, for me as a writer, like who are these grandparents? Like let me, like let's explore that a little bit. Like when are they in a room with Jolie and Ethan? What's that like? That was a fun scene.
That is some fun stuff to eavesdrop on, though, because I mean, watching everyone sort of figure out who the other person is. Right. Yeah. Like, and again, this goes back to novels. You can do interiority and you can do time in a way that other people can't. But I was really invested. I was really invested in seeing where the story went, because I don't really have a blueprint for this particular version, of guy walks into a bar. Right. And that really is the fun of this. And as much as there's, some complications, let's call it, it really was a pleasure to read. How does it feel putting this book out into the world? I mean, it's been a minute since City on Fire. Obviously, the press around City on Fire was slightly different.
Well, the press, the press period was different. I mean,
it was. It really was.
The press was different. That was like a really different world, like newspapers. Whoa.
All of the bylines that are gone now.
Totally.
It's really disturbing.
Well, the bookworm is coming back. So that's like there are a few good things, good news for the world of books. But yeah, it's just like, it's a different world. It's a very personal book to me.
Yeah.
And therefore, in the same way that like the people who are closest to us are sometimes the hardest to have empathy for.
Mm-hmm.
The books that are the closest to us as writers are sometimes the hardest to see. And so it's like, I'm now at that point where I like totally can. I don't know what it is. Just going out there. I like the cover. I'm happy with the cover. I feel like there's some writing in here that's, what I was put here to do. Like, or is, I'm not going to do it any better than that.
Yeah, all of that I get. Yeah, all of that I get. It feels, I mean, it just feels like you've put yourself out in the world in a very different way with this book, and that you could be a little more contained with the last book and a little more circumspect and have a different kind of story to tell about the creation of that book and everything else. And this just, I kind of feel like, oof. Okay, do you have any skin left? Like, do you have that? It kind of feels like you just put it all out on the table and said, okay.
What's the line in there's a line in Salinger and it's like, write with all your stars out.
Something like that.
It's the thing you copy down in your journal when you're a teenager. You're like, yes, I must do that. And then you spend like the next 30 years trying to figure out like what that actually means.
Right.
And like, I felt like at portions here, like it felt like that. And it was scary to do that. And And it also, the other thing that's interesting is I was really, really aggressively resisting anytime I hit a point where I felt like something was conforming to a label, or like, oh, trauma plot, like, oh, this character's, suffering from X or whatever. I just like ran away from it. And that's why I think I ended up with something that is just kind of maybe its own thing, or maybe why it felt surprising to you at all these turns, because you can't quite be like, oh, I'm reading a different version of this other book. Like, you don't know where the beats are. You're just like,
yeah. And I really liked not knowing where the beats are. And I mean, also just coming back to you can have a coming of age if you're 70, you can do it if you're 13, you can do it if you're 33. Coming of age is not limited to the adolescents among us. And we're getting multiple comings of age in the second coming, which I liked seeing how they collided with each other.
I feel like what the book taught me.
Uh-huh.
You asked me, like, how is the book changed? Is the life is a coming of age.
Yeah, right.
Like the whole thing. And I had wanted to like narrate my life to myself. Like, here I am, I'm 40, I have kids or whatever. And sometimes like, oh, like I've like, things are stable. And at other times to be like, I'm supposed to be like, things are stable. Why do I still feel like a little kid, like in as an imposter inhabiting an adult life? And now I think, having written this, I'm just like, life is a coming of age, and the more you fight that, the more the more problems you're going to have, and the more you can kind of go with that. Like, grace is to be found in like being like, all is change, I'm going to keep changing. And so I hope it can kind of like explode the coming of age narrative, where you arrive at some point, marriage usually, and just kind of like make it big enough for us all to climb inside.
Yeah, dude, that's the perfect place to end this, because I mean, yeah. So Garth Risk Hallberg, thank you so much for joining us on Poured Over. The Second Coming is out now, and if you haven't read City on Fire, go back and find that. And then there's also a field guide to the North American family, which is a little bit more of an art book, but totally worth checking out. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Miwa.
Hello, readers. It's time for another TBR Topoff. We're going to recommend a couple of great books to pick up when you stop in for your copy of The Second Coming. I'm Marc at my Barnes & Noble store in Cincinnati, and I'm joined by a brand new book buddy in the Detroit area. Donald, hello. Welcome.
Hi, I am so thrilled to be able to join the TBR Topoff team. I am just so thrilled to be here today.
Excellent. Happy to have you. I know that you are a book wizard in your own store, so really happy to see your insights and your shares. I'm going to go ahead and kick things off. I am very excited for folks to read The Second Coming. And while I was thinking about family stories that are steeped in trouble, it brought to mind a beautiful book called Razorblade Tears by S.A. Cosby. God, this book is so good. It is emotionally raw. It is deeply moving and really full of suspense as well. It follows two ex-cons on a quest for vengeance while they come to terms with their individual pasts and their shared present. We follow Ike and Buddy Lee, who are two very different characters. They come from very different walks of life. They both have a checkered past in their own right, but are really only connected by their two sons who are married to each other. And unfortunately, they find out that their boys had been murdered. And their paths then collide in really bloody ways, and their journey toward vengeance becomes fueled by this full rage that is also beautifully braided with a reckoning with their own prejudices, be it with each other, be it with their relationship with their sons, really the small town around them, and the world as a whole. It's really powerful, and it's just a great story about fatherhood in a way that I've never read before. The book is exciting, it's hard scrabble, it is very moving, and it's just absolutely wonderful. So check out Razorblade Tears by S.A. Cosby. Donald, what do you have for us?
So I am so thrilled. My first pick to go along with Second Coming is a book by Allegra Goodman. It is called Sam. It was a Read with Jenna book pick when it came out. For me, I was really looking at a book that could really mirror and be a good partner with Second Coming. And the really big thing that stood out with me is both of these books deal with fathers and daughters. This book specifically deals also with drug addiction, which is also featured in Second Coming. So it really works off of that book. Sam, our main character, lives with her mom and her brother. Her brother is dealing with rage issues. She craves her absent father's attention. He's just not part of her life, comes and goes. She wants to become a competitive rock climber, and that kind of mirrors her struggle to overcome the lack of parenting, the lack of support that she feels. She eventually falls for her coach, and then her dad shows back up into her life, and now she wants nothing to do with him because she's found somebody to be her rock, so to speak. But then tragedy hits, right? And she really has to then review her entire future. One of the really awesome things that stuck out to me is there's a really great passage in this book that really sums it up and kind of also shows the shared DNA between these two books. When she heaves herself over the top, she is a castaway collapsing on dry land, battered, broken, and saved. And I think that not only sums up Sam as a character and why her name is the title of this book, but also just the relationship that she has with her dad and the relationship between the characters in Second Coming. So again, that was Sam by Allegra Goodman. Cannot recommend this book enough.
Great pick. Such a good book. You nailed it on your first go. Nice work, Donald. I love that book. But that is unfortunately all we have for today. We could probably do this all day. Thanks so much for tuning in to Poured Over. Please make sure to give us a rating and subscribe so you don't miss an episode. You can also follow us on our socials at Barnes & Noble. Pretty simple. I'm Mark. You can follow my home store at BN Westchester. Donald, where can we find you?
You can follow my home store at BN Fairlane Green.
That's all, everybody. Thanks for tuning in and happy reading. Bye.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.